Chapter 2. Daniel James Kelly took his sister's hand and held it tightly. "Stop sniveling, Peg," he ordered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Peg looked up at him and tried to speak, but out came a strangled sob. Her cheeks were streaked with tears and her eyelids were swollen and red. Danny felt as miserable as Peg looked. He had convinced himself he understood why Ma had sent her children west to the orphan train, but now his throat hurt and his eyes stung as he thought about the dream that had ended. It had been his own dream, one he hadn't dared to share with anyone, even Mike. Even though Dad had died more than 2 years earlier, Danny still remembered vividly his father's touch and smile. After a long while, although he still missed Dad terribly, the dream began. He began to hope that with all his heart that someday his mother would marry again and give him another father. There was a huge empty place in his life that only a father could fill. But all that was in the past. Now he and Peg were going to live with strangers. Andrew McNair, the tall scout who had brought them from New York City to St. Joseph, Missouri on the orphan train, stepped forward to say goodbye to Danny and Peg, and to foster parents who had offered them a home. He handed Alfred Swenson the tightly wrapped bundle that contained Danny and Peg's belongings. "I'll pay a home visit in about 6 months," he said. "Have a safe trip." Alfred Swenson was tall and bony, his sparse, pale blonde hair topped blue, solemn eyes set in deeply sunburned face. Alfred spoke pleasantly to Danny and Peg, but Danny wondered if he ever smiled. Olga Swenson, on the other hand, had the crinkle lines around her mouth and eyes that came from laughing. Her skin was pale as the white paper flowers which girls sometimes sold on the street corners in New York. She was tiny and clutched her black wool shawl around her shoulders as though even her bones were cold. Catherine Banks, who lived in St. Joseph, had been on the train with them, rushed to Danny and Peg for a last goodbye. While Olga stopped to chat with Catherine, Alfred leaned down to speak quietly to Danny and Peg. "My wife's health is fragile," he said. "I want her to feel well and strong again. I thought long and hard about what would be best for Olga, and I decided that the laughter of children would be the medicine that would help her most." Danny nodded. He was heartbroken having to leave his brothers and older sisters, and terrified about going away with strangers, yet at the same time he was terribly afraid that no one would want him and Peg. "You'll find us to be cheerful, sir," he said bravely. "Peg's full of good humor, always able to bring a smile to her mother's face." He gave Peg a poke. But Peg, hanging tightly to his hand, her head pressed against his shoulder, gave another hiccuping sob. If Alfred Swenson wanted laughter, Danny didn't see how in the world he could have picked a less likely pair. Olga stepped forward and, like a bird, tucking a chick under her wing, suddenly engulfed Peg in her black wool shawl. All that could be seen of Peg was a flaming top knot of her curly red hair. "Come," she soothed. "You're tired. Time to take you home. Our farm isn't far from St. Joseph," Alfred told them, as he led the way from the church and down the street. Danny's curiosity overrode his fear as he stared at the passerby. Men dressed in buckskin or in heavy cotton work clothes, women in hoop skirts and small flowered hats, or simple dark print dresses topped with woolen shawls, buggies, horseback riders, wagons, large and small, that rumbled and rattled over the deep ruts in the street. They came to a grand 5-story house with a sign on the front that proclaimed it was the World's Hotel. Olga, her arm around Peg, stopped in the middle of the sagging wooden sidewalk. "Alfred," she said, "let's stop in the hotel for a hot cup of tea before we begin our ride home." "If that's what you wish," Alfred replied, and looked at his wife with tenderness. Danny remembered his own father sometimes looking at Ma like that, and the ache in his throat grew worse. Excitement tipped Olga's cheeks with pink, and added a lilt to her voice as she said to Danny and Peg, "The lobby in the hotel is a beautiful place with red Brussels carpet. I want you to see it." Peg's eyes widened as she entered the huge paneled lobby with its wide, winding staircase. "It's like a castle in the fairy tales Dad told us," she whispered, awestruck. "And you're the princess," Olga said, "with that blue ribbon matching the blue in your eyes. You're the loveliest little girl I've ever seen." The dimple in Peg's right cheek flickered, and she looked up a little taller. "Could I have sugar in my tea, ma'am? Real sugar?" she asked. "Of course," Olga said. She led the way down the groups of people who milled around the lobby. Danny stared admiringly at the two narrow-waisted women with red cheeks and lips past him. Their bright dresses had wide skirts that held out with hoops, and Danny had to jump aside to get out of the way. "They're actresses," Olga told Danny, and Peg in a low voice. "They're with a traveling theater company that stopped here on their way to St. Louis." Peg twisted to stare at the women, and Olga gave Peg's hand a little tug. A man with a deep, resonant voice called to the two women and strode toward them. Each word was distinct, as musical as though he'd been rung by a bell. He was not a tall man, but he held himself so that he seemed tall. As he conversed with the women, he postured and posed, obviously aware that many people in the hotel lobby were watching him. Alfred scowled. "I don't like that fellow," he muttered to Olga. "Artemus Gund heard him declaring in the Buffalo Saloon. He's a rabid Southern sympathizer and an anti-abolitionist." "What's that?" Danny asked. "A man who believes in slavery," Alfred explained, "and who wants to make his feelings known even when they're not wanted or asked for." Danny shivered and looked away from the man. Dad taught him that slavery was terribly wrong. Life was hard enough without having to belong to somebody else. Danny couldn't imagine being forced to work his whole life for someone who could do whatever he wanted with him. Do people listen to him, he asked. Only those as foolish as he. Olga sniffed. The fellow's just an actor, no one important. What's his name? Danny asked. Booth, Alfred said. John Wilkes Booth. Enough of those people, Olga interrupted. Let's have our tea and some shortbread cookies with it. Cookies? Peg's expression flashed with delight to concern. Danny loves cookies, but I do too, she said. Don't let him eat them all. Olga smiled and Danny began to relax. If they couldn't be with their own mother, at least these people seemed kind. Suddenly someone shoved past Danny and he stumbled, regaining his balance. Hey, Danny exclaimed, but the heavy-set man, who had been responsible, neither saw nor heard Danny. He stomped across the lobby to face John Wilkes Booth. Danny couldn't hear what the two men were saying to each other, but anger darkened their faces. Olga edged closer to Alfred. True gentlemen remember their behavior while in a public place, she murmured. Alfred put a hand on her arm, and there was sadness in his voice as he said, True gentlemen would not be so ready to divide our country. An anxious-looking man in a gray coat rushed to intercede. Danny heard him say sternly, Gentlemen, I must ask you to leave this hotel. You will have to continue your conversation outside. Booth and the man who had confronted him didn't answer. They simply turned to the main doorway and strode from the lobby. Olga shooed Danny and Peg toward the restaurant, but Danny carried with him the image of that terrible hatred that had twisted both men's faces and burned in their eyes.